I made a phone call 8 months ago that I had been not making for 40 years, and the person who answered it said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Something that did not go the way I had spent 40 years imagining it would go, and that turned out, in the not dash going dash the dash way dash I dash had dash imagined, to be the most important conversation of my adult life. My name is Gerald. I'm 76 years old, and what I want to tell you today is not about the apology itself, though the apology matters, and I will tell you about it, but about what the response to it showed me about what I had been carrying for 40 years, and what the carrying had actually been for. I need to begin with what I did, because the apology is not meaningful without the account of what the apology was for, and because the account requires the honesty that 40 years of carrying something has finally, at 76, made available to me in a form that I can say out loud without the management that I applied to it for most of those 40 years. In the spring of 1983, when I was 36 years old and working as a manager at a manufacturing company in Cleveland, I passed over a man named Curtis for a promotion that he had earned and that he deserved, and that I gave instead to a man who had not earned it and did not deserve it in the same measure. And the reason I passed over Curtis was not professional and was not based on performance and was not anything that I could have stated out loud in a meeting without being immediately and correctly identified as someone who was doing something wrong. The reason I passed over Curtis was that he was black and the man I promoted was not, and the promotion decision was made in the specific and cowardly way that such decisions were made in that time and in that environment, not through any explicit statement of the reason, but through the accumulation of qualifications and reservations and alternative assessments that were the vocabulary of exclusion in a workplace that had not yet been required to examine that vocabulary. And I was the manager who made the decision, and I made it with full knowledge of what I was doing and why, and I have known for 40 years that what I did was wrong. I want to say that I knew it was wrong at the time, because I think the knowing is important to the account, and because I am not trying to claim the partial exculpation of ignorance. I knew it was wrong. I had told myself, in the weeks before the decision, a series of things that were designed to make the wrong decision feel like a reasonable one, the standard vocabulary of self-justification that people use when they are about to do something they know to be wrong, and need to make it manageable enough to do. And the vocabulary worked in the sense that I made the decision and moved forward with it and continued my professional life without the decision being visible to anyone around me as the specific and personal wrong that I understood it to be. Curtis left the company within a year of the decision. I do not know whether he understood why he had been passed over, whether the reason was legible to him in the way it was legible to me from the inside, but he left, and the leaving was its own form of the accounting, the departure of a man who had been told, in the language of a decision that could not be stated openly, that the place did not value him in the proportion that his work merited, and the departure was something I noticed and registered and filed in the category of consequences I was responsible for without addressing. I thought about Curtis across the 40 years after that decision with the specific and intermittent quality of something that is not consciously maintained, but that returns at intervals with the consistency of something that has not been resolved, something that the interior knows is still open, and that the interior returns to periodically in the same way that the tongue returns to a sore tooth, not constantly, but reliably, not with pleasure, but with the particular persistence of unfinished business that has no clear path to being finished. I thought about him when race was in the news, which across 40 years was frequent, and when the specific language of workplace discrimination entered public conversation in ways that described, with the precision that I recognized from the inside, the mechanism of what I had done. I thought about him when I watched my own children navigate their professional lives, and when I thought about what it would mean for one of them to be passed over for something they had earned for a reason that had nothing to do with their merit. I thought about him with a quality of grief that I did not acknowledge as grief for a long time, when the accounting of my own professional life produced the recognition that the things I was most proud of in it were not available as unmixed pride, because the foundation of them included this: the decision in 1983, the wrong thing done with full knowledge of its wrongness. The carrying was its own form of the accounting. I want to say that because I think it is important to acknowledge that the 40 years of intermittent returning to the decision was not nothing, was not the comfortable forgetting that the person who has done something wrong and simply moved on has access to. But the carrying was also not sufficient, and I understood it was not sufficient and continued to carry it in the insufficient form, because the sufficient form, the apology, the direct and personal acknowledgement to Curtis himself of what had been done and why, required finding him and facing him and saying the thing out loud that I had been not saying for 40 years. And the not saying had been, I understand now at 76, the protection, the same protection that the not saying always is, the avoidance of the exposure that the saying requires. I retired in 2017, and the retirement produced. As I have come to understand, retirement tends to produce in people who have been using the structure of professional life as the primary organizer of their attention, a quality of interior quiet that made the unresolved things more audible than they had been when the professional structure was providing the ambient noise. Curtis became more audible in the retirement, returned with a frequency and a quality that I had not experienced in the working years, and I sat with the returning for 3 years without acting on it, which is the way the carrying had always worked, the returning and the sitting and the not acting. My wife, whose name is Barbara, knew something was in the sitting, because she has known me for 48 years, and because the quality of my sitting with something unresolved is, apparently, visible to someone who has been observing it for 4 decades. And she asked me in the 2nd year of the retirement what I was working on in there, which is the phrase she uses for the interior processing that she has observed across our marriage. And I told her, for the first time and in the honest form, rather than the managed one, about Curtis and about 1983 and about what I had done and why and what I had been carrying since. She was quiet for a long time after I told her. Barbara is not a person who responds quickly to things that require significant processing, and what I had just told her was significant, was the 40-year-old account of something her husband had done before she knew him and had never told her, and that required her to hold, alongside the person she knew him to be, the person he had been capable of being in 1983, and the holding of those two things together required time. When she spoke, she did not say what I had expected her to say, which was some version of the reassurance that the time elapsed and a genuine regret I felt were sufficient, that the carrying was itself a form of the accounting, and that nothing further was required. She said, quietly and without accusation, that it sounded like something I needed to do something about, rather than something I needed to keep carrying, and she said it in the tone of someone who is saying the obvious thing that the person they are speaking to has known for some time and has not yet been able to act on. She was right. She has been right about most things across 48 years, and this was not the exception. I found Curtis in 2024, not easily, because 40 years is a long time, and people move and change, and the connections that would have made finding him straightforward in his professional life were long dissolved. But through the combination of the Internet's various mechanisms for locating people and the help of someone who had known us both at the company, I found him, found that he was 71 years old and lived in Atlanta and had built, after leaving the company in Cleveland, a professional life of genuine accomplishment in his own right, had started a business that had grown into something real, and had retired from it with the kind of record that makes clear the assessment I made of him. 1983 was not the accurate assessment. I am glad his life went well. I want to say that, and I want to be honest that the gladness is complicated. That part of the gladness is the relief that the wrong I did not define the arc of his professional life in the way it might have, and that the relief is itself something I have had to examine, because the relief contains within it the implicit hope that the harm was limited, that the thing I did was less consequential than it would have been if his life had gone badly. And that hope is a form of self-interest that I have tried to be honest about without letting the honesty of it become its own form of avoidance. I wrote a letter first. Not because I thought a letter was sufficient, but because I needed to practice the saying before I could make the call. Needed to find the form of the words that was honest without being the kind of elaborate and self-focused account of my own guilt that converts an apology into a burden on the person receiving it. The kind of apology that is more about the relief of the person giving it than the acknowledgement owed to the person who received the harm. This is the trap that long-deferred apologies fall into, the conversion of genuine remorse into a request for absolution that places the burden of providing absolution on the person who has already borne the burden of the harm. I wrote and rewrote the letter across several weeks, and what I arrived at was something short rather than elaborate, direct rather than expressive, saying what I had done, and that I knew it was wrong when I did it, and that I had been carrying it, and that I wanted him to know that I knew. Not because the knowing resolved anything for him, or obligated him to anything in return, but because the not knowing on his part, or the partial knowing, without the direct acknowledgement, was itself an ongoing cost that I was still imposing on him by not addressing it, and that I wanted to stop imposing it. I called him in February of this year. I had his number from the letter exchange, because he had written back, briefly and without much expressiveness, acknowledging that he had received my letter and that he was willing to speak. The brevity of the response had not told me how the call was going to go, had not told me whether the willingness to speak was the willingness of someone who had processed the harm and was at peace with the history, or the willingness of someone who had things to say that the letter had not produced the context for. And I made the call without knowing which it was, which was itself a form of the exposure, the stepping into the unknown outcome that the 40 years of not calling had been protecting me from. He answered on the second ring. His voice was the voice of a 71-year-old man that I had not heard since 1983, and that was both unfamiliar in its age and recognizable in some quality underneath the age, the specific quality of a person's voice that persists across the changes. And I said his name and told him mine, and he said he remembered me, which was the first of the things he said that I had not expected. I said what I had prepared to say, said it in the form I had found across the weeks of writing and rewriting, said I had done something wrong in 1983, said I had known it was wrong when I did it, said what the reason had been without euphemism or management, said I had been carrying it and that I was sorry, not with the elaborate expression of guilt that I had promised myself I would not make the burden of the call, but with the directness that the situation required, and that 40 years of not being direct about it had made more difficult and more necessary. He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who does not know what to say, but the considered quiet of someone who is deciding what to say from the range of things available to say. And what he said was not what I had spent 40 years imagining he would say, was not the absolution that some part of me had been hoping for, or the anger that another part of me had been expecting, or the extended account of what the decision had cost him that I would have understood as appropriate. He said, I knew. I knew at the time. He said it without anger, without the performance of the hurt that he was entitled to perform, with the flat and factual tone of someone who has known something for 40 years and who is confirming that the knowing was always there, that the thing I had been carrying as my private knowledge of my own wrongdoing had been his knowledge too, that the decision I had made and not named had been legible to him in the way. I had always feared it might be legible, but had never known for certain. The knowing it was legible to him changed something in me that I am still in the process of identifying. Not because the legibility made it worse, exactly, but because it removed the last ambiguity from the account, the last possible qualification that the harm might have been less direct than I feared, that he might not have understood what the decision was, or why. And the removal of the ambiguity was not relief, but the specific and clarifying discomfort of standing without any remaining protection in front of the full truth of what you did. He said other things in the call that I want to tell you about because they are the part that has stayed with me most, and that has changed my understanding. of what I was carrying and what it was for. He said that what had mattered to him at the time was not the promotion, though the promotion mattered and the loss of it was real, but the not naming of it, the fact that the decision had been made and not named, and that he had carried the knowledge of it alone, without the direct acknowledgement from me that would have confirmed that what he knew was real and was not his misreading of a legitimate professional decision. He said the not naming had made the harm more isolating than the harm itself, had made it something he could not fully address or process, because it had never been made visible in the form that would have allowed the addressing, and that what the letter and the call had done, whatever else they did or did not do, was make it visible, confirm for him 40 years later that what he had known was accurate, that his assessment of what had happened to him had been correct. I had not understood this. I want to say that clearly, because it changed something fundamental in my understanding of what the 40 years of not calling had cost, not only to me but to him, the ongoing and unacknowledged cost of carrying the knowledge of a harm that had never been confirmed by the person who had done it, the particular isolation of a wrong that exists clearly to the person who received it and has never been acknowledged by the person who did it, and that the not acknowledging is its own ongoing harm, a continuation of the original wrong in the form of the refusal to confirm what the wronged person knows. I had been continuing the harm for 40 years by carrying the knowledge of it without acknowledging it to him. That is what I understood from the call, sitting with what he had said, and the understanding was the most significant thing the call produced, more significant than any relief I felt from having made the apology, because it showed me that the carrying, which I had understood as a form of the accounting, as evidence of the remorse that the decision produced in me, had also been, simultaneously, and without my understanding it, a form of the continued harm, the ongoing protection of myself from the exposure of the acknowledgement at the cost of his continued isolation inside the unconfirmed knowledge. We talked for almost an hour. He told me about his life, about the business he had built, and what building it had required, and what it had produced, and about Atlanta and his family. And I told him about mine, and the conversation moved, in its second half, from the specific subject of 1983 into something more like the ordinary conversation of two people who are getting to know each other under unusual circumstances. Two 70-something men who had been connected by a wrong done 4 decades ago, and who were, in this call, something closer to the two people they actually were, rather than the roles the wrong had put them in. He said, near the end of the call, something that I have thought about almost every day since, which is that he did not know whether he forgave me, that forgiveness was not something he could declare in a phone call after 40 years, and that he was not sure it was something he owed me regardless, but that the call had given him something he had not expected to receive, which was the external confirmation of what he had always known, and that the confirmation had a value he had not anticipated, and that he was glad I had called, and that he hoped I would be well. I told him the same, and I meant it with the full weight of what I understood, in the hour of that conversation, about what the 40 years had been, and what the call had and had not resolved, and what the not resolving was, in its honest form, and what the honest form was worth. I want to say something about the apology as a practice, as a thing that human beings do with each other, and that I had, for 40 years, understood primarily as a transaction, as the exchange of the acknowledgement of wrong for the receipt of forgiveness, and what I understand now, from the inside of this specific and long-deferred version of it, about what it actually is and what it is actually for. The apology is not primarily for the forgiveness. I have come to understand this as the central thing, the thing that the 40 years of imagining the call had obscured by casting it in the transactional form, the form in which I offer the acknowledgement and receive the absolution, and the account is closed. The account does not close that way. Curtis did not give me absolution, and he did not owe me absolution, and the absence of the absolution is not a deficiency in the call, but an accurate reflection of what the call was for and was not for. What the call was for was the confirmation, the making visible of the thing that had existed in the unconfirmed form for 40 years, the direct acknowledgement from the person who did the harm to the person who received it that the harm was real and was understood, and was not the product of the wronged person's misreading of a neutral event. That confirmation is not absolution, and is not the closing of the account, and is, in Curtis's own account of it, something that had a value he had not anticipated, which tells me that the value was real, and that the withholding of it across 40 years had been a real cost, and that the giving of it, however late, was not nothing. It was not nothing. That is what I want to say to you, if you are carrying something that requires the direct acknowledgement, and that you have been not giving for years or decades in the protective form of the carrying without the saying. The saying is not the same as the carrying. The carrying is private, and the saying is exposed, and the exposure is what the carrying has been protecting you from. And the protection, however genuine, is also a continuation of the thing being protected, a continued imposition on the person who is waiting, perhaps without knowing they are waiting, for the confirmation that makes their knowledge of what happened to them real rather than suspected. Gerald is 76 years old, and Curtis is 71, and the conversation happened in February of this year, and I am not absolved, and the account is not closed, and I am still, in certain moments and from certain angles, the man who made that decision in 1983 with full knowledge of its wrongness. And I am also, in the making of the call and the saying of the thing and the receiving of what Curtis said in return, the man who stopped protecting himself from the saying and gave the confirmation that 40 years of carrying had withheld. Both of those men are me. I have learned to hold them both, not with the comfort of the resolved account, but with the honesty of the full one, which is harder and more accurate, and which is, at 76, the only form of the accounting I am still capable of offering. The honest one, the one that does not close the account, but does, finally, and at 40 years of lateness, stop pretending it was never open. Make the call. If you have something to confirm to someone, make the call. The absolution may not come, and the account may not close, and those are not the reasons to make it. The confirmation is the reason. The making visible of the thing that exists in the unconfirmed form is the reason. The stopping of the ongoing harm of the not saying is the reason. Make the call while both of you are still here to make it. That is the only thing I would tell my 36-year-old self if I could tell him anything. And it is the thing I am telling you now, because the telling is still available, and the call is still available. And the 40 years of carrying is a long time to wait for something that was always, from the beginning, simply a matter of picking up the phone